Well, good evening, everyone. As many of you may know me already, or some of you may not, my name is Sarah Husby, and I'm the Executive Director with Great Old Broads for Wilderness. I want to thank you all for joining us on a wonderful May 1st evening. I hope the weather is beautiful where you are and your allergies are not affecting you too badly. We are here today to talk about the Bureau of Land Management's public rule that they released a couple of weeks ago, and this really great opportunity that we have as an organization, as broadband chapters, and as individuals to weigh in and really make a difference on something that is going to be precedent setting and also doesn't come around that often. This evening, I am joined with us by two of our great partners of Great Old Broads for Wilderness. We have Michael Carroll, who is with the Wilderness Society, and then we have Danielle Murray, who is with Conservation Lands Foundation. So I will actually let both of them introduce themselves a little bit more in just a moment, and then we will get started with the presentation. I do want everyone to know that this is being recorded and that Great Old Broads for Wilderness will be sending out this recording to everyone who signed up for our webinar, along with our email list, and we will be sending out materials and such, which I'll discuss at the end. We're also going to be having a second webinar at the end of May. We are still working on the dates to talk about grazing on BLM public land. And does this tie into the public lands ruling, and how this also ties into the BLM grazing rule, which will be coming out later on this year, and the importance of all of that and staying engaged also for that phase of the work. So I will pass this over to Michael and Danielle to get started.
I'll kick us off and then hand it over to Danielle, who's going to do the bulk of the presentation. I'm Michael Carroll. I'm the BLM campaign director at the Wilderness Society. I've been at the Wilderness Society for 25 years. I remember the bad old days of Great Old Broads when Susan Touche used to take people around sweeping red rocks across Moab. So I'm super excited to be actually talking to broads, and to know that the broads across the country are going to be getting involved in all of this and really helping us to push for a really good rule at the end of all of this. And with that, I'll turn it over to my partner in crime, Danielle Murray.
Hi guys, Danielle Murray. I'm with the Conservation Lands Foundation. I am the Senior Policy Director. Michael has a few years on me. I've been working on BLM public lands policy for about 15 years now, and also excited to be working with the Great Old Broads. I think this is a really important opportunity, and I think the Great Old Broads can really make a difference here. So with that, I was just going to jump into the webinar. And I will say we have about 20 slides. However, we're going to go rather quickly, and I want to leave a lot of room for discussion and also getting out a little bit early, because I know some folks it's 7 o'clock East Coast time. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the context of the rule, why the rule is so important, kind of the theory of change, and then what's in the rule at a really high level. And then also I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to talk a little bit about how the broads can engage. So why the public lands rule? Why now? So as everyone knows, the president has an agenda, America the Beautiful, that focuses on 30 by 30. And 30 by 30 is not just a number. A lot of people think it's like a political campaign. It's not. It's focused on science. And it's focused on the science that says, if you protect our natural ecosystems, then you sequester CO2, you reduce extraction, and you allow for humans and animals to adapt. And again, this is all science-based. This is not some kind of campaign for 30 by 30 and 50 by 50. This is about climate change. This is about solving the biodiversity and climate crisis, and that lands are really important. And as we all know, in our nation, BLM manages almost 250 million acres of public lands. But since FLPMA was passed, the Federal Land Policy Management Act, it's really been skewed to commodity-driven development. The corporate entities have really kind of won over the BLM FLPMA multiple use mission. And so the vast majority of lands are open to hard rock mining. 90% are open to oil and gas development. All the lands that can be are open for grazing. And this is really not the intent of FLPMA. And then if we look at the opportunities, so the Center for American Progress and Conservation Science Partners did a study, and they looked at land ownership and the viability of protecting intact landscapes. And they found, based on USGS, that we have about 13% of our nation's public lands are protected. But the greatest opportunity to kind of bump that up and reach 30 by 30 is protections for BLM lands. And that's because there's 250 million acres. And while a lot of them are open to these extractive uses and grazing, a lot of them remain in their natural state. This is our nation's greatest opportunity. And so if we tie that with the administration's agenda, I think that's where we get kind of the impetus for this rule. This is just another way to look at the public lands rule opportunity. So on the left, you see, this is all lower 48. So sorry if there's any broads in Alaska, but this is kind of our public lands in the West. You can see Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, Park Service, and Fish and Wildlife Service. And on the right, you see just kind of unprotected lands popping. And these are the interconnected tissues between our Forest Service, our parks. I mean, BLM manages 3 times as many public lands as the Park Service. So, I mean, when we think about the opportunity for protections, this is really where it's at. And so how do we change that, right? Like, how do we have more conservation on public lands that are managed by the Bureau of Land Management? Well, one, a lot of us work on Antiquities Act National Monument campaigns. We're very excited about them. We just got a VICWMA designated. Legislation is possible. It happens. We had legislation in Nevada with the Fallon legislation that had 500,000 acres of wilderness area designated. So even in unfavorable Congresses, it happens. The third, though, is administrative protections, and that can come in rulemaking or planning. And this is really what we're focused on today. And one thing I like to point out about this third kind of bucket is the first 2 are kind of thrust on the agency, right? You know, advocates decide they want a piece of area, they want area protected through Antiquities Act or legislation, and we work to get that to happen. And then BLM has to manage it that way. This third bucket is really the administration taking accountability for conservation in the first time in their history. Okay, so looking at a rule, I know a rulemaking or regulations are really wonky. What it is, it's an interpretation of a law, and it has the force and effect of law, and it can have substantial implications for policy implementation. So if you have a regulation in place, the BLM must follow it. It is enforceable. It is enforceable by the Great Old Broads. BLM must do certain things in planning moving forward, and we'll talk about some of those things. It's also challengeable legally. We can force the agency, once this rule is in place, to take certain measures. And again, we'll talk more about that. It also cannot be just thrown out in a new administration. There is durability to a rulemaking, and the new administration has to go through a substantial, lengthy process to undo it and validate why they're undoing it rationally. And there's a lot of case law that shows that the agency just can't decide to make kind of an ad hoc, like, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, once this rule is in place based on law, it's going to be really hard to undo. So this is our theory of change. So we have a public lands rulemaking. There's some sort of, that's the paradigm shift. And then future planning and management looks differently. And so we kind of have this theory of change that starts at the top and kind of goes through BLM planning, and then you have individual planning efforts throughout the nation, which kind of change how BLM lands are managed throughout the West. And is a lot where the Great Old Broads come in, because Great Old Broads can reach the top levels of the administration to help influence this rulemaking. They also work at the local level in planning. So it's kind of this top-down, bottom-up approach, which I think is really powerful for the Broads. This is just an example of planning now. So say a rule was in place, BLM has 42 million acres of planning actively, and 53 million acres expected over the next several years. This is just a snapshot of some of the planning ongoing. And this is just an example that in FLPMA, it says BLM has to, over time, update planning. So if you have a new rule in place, they have to, over time, update plans, which means conservation will be implemented throughout those plans. 42 million acres is huge. Another reason why this rule is so important, and this is something that's really important to the Conservation Lands Foundation, and I know all of you, is I talked about a VICWMA. We've experienced that a lot of our national monument campaigns and those that are successful are based on these administrative protections that happen through planning. So if you look at this map, I know some of this is hard. This is all from the Climate Atlas. Aviquame, I crossed out proposed. Now it's the National Monument. When I first started doing this presentation, it was proposed. If you look at Aviquame, most of this area is either designated wilderness, which is not highlighted, but an ACEC. And that ACEC hasn't been in place since the 80s, and it's helped protect this region and keep it intact. So one day it could become a national monument. And we're just not doing enough of these administrative protections right now. I call them our like JV squad or like B squad or like our future national conservation lands. A lot of these designations, we see it in Grand Staircase. We saw it in Oregon Mountains, Desert Peaks. Another example is the Owahis. And I know I have met some great broads when I was out working on the Owahis campaign. A lot of the Owahis is made up of wilderness study areas, which are also an administrative designation. And we can talk a little bit more about how wilderness study areas fit into this effort. But at some point in time, BLM did designate wilderness study areas. And again, this is like the backbone of these future national conservation lands. Okay, so what is in the rule? We're going to do 4 or 5 slides of what is in the rule, and then we can get into more detailed questions. And I'm going to preface this by saying I didn't write the rule. We're still learning. We have attorneys that are analyzing the rule. There will be 3 in-person meetings and 2 virtual meetings. So questions that Michael and I can't answer, I really encourage the BLM to answer because there's a lot of those, but I'll give you the high level of kind of what we know. So the highlight of the rule is that it considers conservation as a use. It puts it on par with other uses. And what this would do is it would change, as I said, future planning and management. And the rule really focuses on a couple of key concepts. Resilient ecosystems is one of it. And BLM has kind of decided that in order to have longevity and to manage for multiple uses, they have to have intact, resilient ecosystems to manage, and that they need to do a better job with conservation. So as far as resilient ecosystems, protecting intact landscapes is key, and then achieving land health by applying land health standards. And if you work in the grazing community, you've heard this term a lot, this would be applied to all programmatic areas. And then it identifies tools to advance conservation management. And so it talks a lot about areas of critical environmental concern, mitigation, restoration, and conservation leasing. That was a little bit muddled, but we're going to get into a little bit more detail and I'm going to say it better, I promise. Okay, so in general, BLM relies on the presence of healthy landscapes and resilient ecosystems to fulfill their multiple use and sustain yield mission. And so in order to ensure that BLM has healthy landscapes and resilient ecosystems in the future, they must promote the use of conservation and management decisions. This is the crux of the rule. This is like, we have to do better or else we're not going to fulfill our multiple use and sustain yield mission if we don't manage for conservation. And so again, they've identified several ways to do that: intact landscapes and land health standards. So the protection of intact landscapes, and this is going to get to where there's some of the teeth are in future planning, which I think some of your ears will perk up. So in the future, this proposed rule, if passed, when passed, the BLM revises a resource management plan. They must identify intact landscapes and determine which, if any, those tracts of public lands will be put to a conservation use. They will also have to track impacts to intact landscapes, whether they choose to protect them or not. There will be a tracking system, which will be stored in a national kind of database or tracking system. So think that as we move forward, BLM is going to have to monitor for intact landscapes, and they're going to have to track impacts to them. We're going to be able to influence those decisions. And they're also going to have to see, are we losing landscapes? Are we increasing intact landscapes? What does that look like on a national level? Management for land health. Again, outside of grazing, BLM is going to have to consider land health standards and decision-making, regardless of program area. They're going to have to inventory based on these fundamentals, not less than every 5 years. So areas of critical environmental concern, this is a really exciting part of the rule. ACECs are identified in FLTMA. And so really this is the first time that there will be a rule enforcing the importance of ACECs. So this rule really makes ACECs as like the principal designation for protecting values, resources, cultural, scenic, natural. I encourage folks to actually go to the rule because the types of resources and values that ACECs are now set up to protect in this rule is very broad. Ecosystems, habitat, health. BLM must identify lands for ACEC designation as part of the RMP planning, revision, and my dog is barking, process. And anytime BLM does an amendment, all planning documents must include at least one alternative that analyzes ACECs. It also defines criteria for ACEC designation. And so there's a list of 3 criteria. Again, I encourage you all to go look at that. But this is really, the BLM has to, every new plan that comes out, they have to analyze, there has to be an alternative. It also says that we can nominate ACECs outside of the planning process. So this is new. This was in that interim management that came out several months back, but we can ask the BLM to manage for those values until the next planning process. So BLM can actually implement interim manage to manage ACECs. And then the other thing, which I think is really important because we all were very upset about this in the last administration, is that there was so many ACECs which were just removed through planning without any sort of analysis. And so to remove an ACEC, the BLM must find the ACEC is no longer warranted. And that is something, again, that is enforceable. So say there is an ACEC for sage grouse, the BLM must show that the sage grouse is now recovered. Or maybe there's no sage grouse, but that's a horrible thing to say. But it just has to be not warranted, and they have to prove that, and that is enforceable. Restoration, BLM highlights the importance of restoration. This is another kind of hook in the rule that BLM must include a restoration plan in any RMP adopted or revised. Each restoration plan must have goals, objectives, and management actions, and BLM must identify landscapes for restoration not less than every 5 years. So this is another hook outside of planning. You don't have to wait for a new plan. BLM must look for restoration opportunities. BLM also highlights mitigation. They should apply the mitigation hierarchy. A lot of people think mitigation is just compensation, but really mitigation is avoiding impacts first, or mitigating, and to the maximum extent possible. And we're going to see how this plays out in implementation. The BLM must require mitigation to address adverse impacts to important, scarce, or sensitive resources. And that is also a pretty broad definition. So, here's another hook that we can require BLM if the resources fit within important, scarce, or sensitive, we can require mitigation, which is at first avoid, minimize, and then potentially compensate. The other that is getting a lot of attention is conservation leases, and we can answer some questions on that, but really I would consider conservation leases as kind of like conservation easements. They use leases because that's a term in FLTMA, so they're being consistent, but really this is like a conservation easement. It can be instituted as part of mitigation or as part of a restoration plan. And then recommended improvements, we have several here, and we can send out all of this information. And I'm sure Michael is already sharing links, but there was a IM on habitat connectivity that's not really mentioned in the rule, and we want to make sure that habitat connectivity is highlighted. Old growth and mature forests. I know that there is I think a rule being started for that pretty soon. And we just want to make sure that there is connection with old growth because there was an executive order. Intact natural landscapes we talked about. We are hoping to see something included in the rule, the final rule, that talks about wilderness or wilderness characteristics. We also are hoping that if they are identified, that they have to be protected unless certain valid existing rights are already in place. And so really pushing that. Similar to areas of environmental concern, we are hoping that maybe if a area meets the criteria, it be managed that way unless factors are met. So it puts the onus on BLM to show why it shouldn't be managed as an ACEC rather than the other way around. And the last is tribal consultation and co-management. And this, again, there is a lot in this rule that talks about consultation and co-management, and it includes Indigenous knowledge. We just want to make sure that's further fleshed out in the final rule. Okay, we have a lot of resources. These are all active links. They don't look like this. We can share the PowerPoint. But we have a toolkit. We have a link to the draft rule. We've really worked on background messaging and talking points. And this campaign has been an active campaign for about 2.5 years. And really, we've been talking about balance and the importance of values. This doesn't completely change, grazing or oil and gas, but it does bring balance to the agency. It's a huge step forward. And just so some of those talking points, which in our political climate makes this rule more viable, are part of kind of our messaging. We have a public comment portal where you can comment, and I know Sarah's going to talk a little bit about what Broads does, but your community, anyone, there is a draft comment letter there, and we're really trying to drum up comments of support. We're looking for both substantive comments, which get into the meat of the rule, but also just general support comments, just going and clicking yes and putting your name on that. And we are continuing to develop action alerts and press statements and reacting to kind of the community and what we're hearing. And so those are things that we can continue to share with the Broads team, and they can continue to share them with all of you. And then this is what we're telling supporters that I've done the rule for, or done this presentation for in the past about the BLM rule, but then I'm going to turn it over to Sarah. So just the comment period ends on the 20th. And again, I said substantive comments or just general comments are great. There will be in-person meetings. We don't know where those will be yet. The 3 in-person meetings will not be listening sessions, as in the community can give feedback to the BLM, but the BLM is going to be describing what the rule does to the public, but we still want to show out and show a lot of support for the rule in those meetings. And there will be 2 virtual meetings that the BLM hosts. We've also asked the BLM to be really helpful if they gave more fact sheets on this rule and what the rule does. And if we see some of those, we'll definitely be sharing those around. And then again, Michael and I have been working on LTEs, guest columns, and op-eds. Oh, and I put CLF will draft and submit. That's not for you guys. That was for someone else. But we would love to work with Broads if you have ideas on, helping to pitch that. And then again, we have tons of social that we will be sharing and have been sharing, and it's all based around Act Now for Public Lands, which is kind of the campaign, slogan, branding, and lots of good stuff for you to share on your personal socials or groups or whatever. And so with that, I think I'm done. No, I'm not. I have one more. Then I'm turning it over to Sarah. This is just a look at a couple of snapshots at the Act Now for Public Lands website. It's unbranded. It has a lot of great resources, background resources to show support. It also, again, has that public comment portal. Broads might do something different, but just flagging that for you guys. And now I really am going to stop. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Danielle. And Michael, thanks for putting some comments in the side over there. I'm actually going to talk kind of next steps, and then we will dive into questions. So what's next steps that's happening for Great Old Broads for Wilderness? So we are giving you all and working with you all really to have the kind of impact that you want and provide the kind of comments that you want. So by the end of this week, you will receive a follow-up email from us that will have a link to this, a link to all the great materials that Michael and Danielle were sharing in here, along with the PowerPoint presentation from today, along with talking points and things that are specific to broads. So what we will be doing is kind of like a three-part process for our organization. If you just want to sign on to a letter or a petition similar what to Danielle was saying, you can do either that one, or we will actually have one that is specific to broads. So we will be sending out some action alerts and ways for you to sign our petition, which we will then make sure gets to the agency folks and turned in a timely manner. So that's option number one. If you just want to sign your name, which we encourage also, because we really want to show the agencies that we have the support for that rule, that is totally fine. And I am happy for you to engage that way. If you're wanting to do something a little bit more substantive, we're going to have multiple different levels of talking points and comments that you can make. So we will have two different kinds of links. So if you want to just do a one-page letter, we will provide some sample language for you for that. Or if you're wanting to do something a little bit more in depth, we will be providing, talking points, again, that are being shared with our partners, but then also that are very relatable and specific to Great Old Broads for Wilderness. So it depends on how big of an in-depth letter you want to submit. If you want to dive in and read the rule and write technical comments because you are a retired scientist or you have worked with the agencies over time and you're retired now and want to do that, please do so. We will be in our email on Friday talking about how we will be coordinating and collecting those comments from you all, just so not only do we know what you are submitting to the agency, but then, down the line, broads might be able to call on you for additional assistance with those really important comments that you're making. Now, some of you might be involved with your local broadband. I do know that some broadbands will be turning in their own specific comments from their area. And we've even heard of talk that some of the different regions might be coordinating and doing state comments amongst the broadbands or their specific region. So please contact your local broadband or your broadband region if you're a part of a BRAT and, find out on how you're going to be engaged. Now, if you're a broadband leader or a BRAT leader listening to this right now, please know that you can reach out to myself, Sally, or Lisa on our staff, and we'll be able to provide you with next steps on what that looks like. And as I mentioned, we are going to be having a second webinar because I've already seen a couple of grazing questions come along on the side, and we know they're going to come up because this does also tie into the grazing rule that the BLM is going to be updating later on this year. We will be having an additional webinar on the either Tuesday the 23rd or Wednesday the 20th. I'm sorry. Either the 23rd or 24th. And so that will be included in the information in the email on Friday that will be going out to all of you with all of these great items that I was mentioning. So we have some additional questions in the side that I want to share with Michael and Danielle and just kind of get some answers for you all. I know that Michael's answered a couple, so if I am repeating myself, I just want to make sure that, any latecomers are able to hear everything and such. So the first one that I think is really important was someone asked, will this rule also apply to the Forest Service if passed?
No. The short answer is no.
This is just BLM. Yeah.
Great.
They will, Sarah, just quickly, the rule will apply to forests that are managed by the BLM, right? So think, there's tons of pinyon juniper forests that, I love recreating in that are just to the west of us here. So they will address forests. It'll just be on BLM lands. Yeah.
BLM manages trees too.
Yes, exactly.
It does, yes.
Great. Another important question that was asked was how much of the lands will be considered intact?
Okay. I'm like multitasking here, and I'm pulling up a study that Pew did on like roadless areas that BLM manages that I can put in the link. It's a great question because there's a definition of intact, and a lot of this rule is going to be fought out through implementation. So TBD on that. But as I said, I think there's still a substantial amount of BLM lands that surprisingly are intact, even with this lack of conservation vision from the agency. But I'm going to pop this study in. And then Michael, I don't know what else, if you want to add anything.
The thing that I said in the chat in response to it, which I think is relevant here, is that this is for the agency to do a better job of defining as they move forward with this rule making. So it's a relevant question for you to raise with them through these public meetings as they start to play out, for sure.
Great. Do we happen to know who might be opposing this rule, or what their argument might be on why the BLM shouldn't do it or not really make it strong?
So Danielle, let me kick it off and then you can jump in here. But largely the opposition has been ideological so far, and really frankly, kind of giving away the game in a lot of ways from our perspective. The opposition has largely noted in their comments, both in the media and up on Capitol Hill, that the management of BLM lands is completely out of balance. And they like it that way, frankly. So we've been increasingly trying to point out that most of the opposition that has really come out of the woodwork initially, whether it's from the grazing community or from the oil and gas community or others, is really acknowledging that they've had the run of the place for quite some time. So we put together a fact sheet that I dropped a link to into the chat, and it's also linked on the toolkit, but we continue to sort of push back against any of those opposition voices that start to pop up. Danielle, anything to add to that?
Yeah, you covered it. You guys know who's in opposition. It's the same voices shouting the same stuff. The sky is falling, the world will end. And then, but really oil and gas has had a monopoly on our BLM lands, and they don't want to give that up.
Yep.
Even for balance.
Thank you. A great follow-up question that we have is, will the Inflation Reduction Act and its green initiatives impact this new rules package?
Good question. I'm just trying to remember the number. So I think there was $500 million in the Inflation Reduction Act that went either to Park Service or BLM for restoration and for habitat. I forget the exact language. And I think 290 of that is actually going to BLM, we found out, which is great. So what I have heard from agency officials is that while it's not directly tied to the rule, there's like a Venn diagram overlap of where they hope to use that money for future planning efforts to implement the rule.
And I'll just add to that, the first salvo in terms of criticism and kind of the opposition, at least on Capitol Hill, raising their voices, have been through the appropriations process and the Interior appropriations. Last week, Secretary Holland testified before the committee, and a number of folks in the House side took shots at her for the rule. Tomorrow, there's actually a hearing, if you have time to tune in. The Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee will be having, Senate Energy Committee is having a hearing on the same appropriations for Interior. We suspect that that's where a lot of the opposition is going to kind of target, is this budget fight, which the Broads should raise their voice over and over again about trying to make sure that there's adequate funding for planning for these agencies, because that's where this is all going to play out.
So, Michael, that actually kind of streams into my next question that was proposed is, does this rule also include the funding for increasing the number of government employees to make this happen? And would there be subcontracting work, especially with the restoration mitigation efforts?
I mean, so for the first part of that answer, and then I'll beg that Danielle answer the second part. No, I mean, the short answer is that this won't deal with the staffing shortages and the problems that BLM has had with the agency sort of being hollowed out during the Trump administration. Director Stone Manning and the staff at the national office have been doing a great job of basically retooling and rebuilding an organization from scratch, but it's taking a ton of time. So it's just been slow. With regards to the second, I may part of your question in terms of contracts and whatnot, Danielle, I mean, it would be full speculation at this point in terms of how
It would be, and I don't want to speak for the agency, and that's why I really encourage, these are great questions and questions that need to be asked in these meetings. So I would encourage that. The other thing I'll just say is give a plug that Great Old Broads always works with CLF on our appropriations campaign, and we're always trying to increase the funding for BLM, especially for conservation initiatives. And so that's something that we're constantly working on in tangent with a rule like this.
Great, thank you. Since we've kind of started talking about conservation leases a little bit, I have a few questions that involve conservation leases and grazing. So we're gonna hop down that train right now. So would a conservation lease either to a business, organization, or an individual be issued a categorical exclusion, which is basically lacking public alternatives, comments, etc.?
My understanding is that yes. These grazing leases / easements, to the best of my understanding, would not impact valid existing rights. And so the categorical exclusion would be pertinent to that. But it also means that you're not going to kick grazers off because of a conservation lease. I think there's been a little bit of kind of speculation about the conservation leasing aspect, and the way that I've tried to interpret it and describe it. And then again, I encourage folks to ask the administration this, is like, consider it an easement, a conservation easement, for two things. One is for mitigation. So think of, you know, a large scale solar project that may impact sage grouse. And then maybe there is a conservation easement put into place on public lands to protect sage grouse that won't impact valid existing rights, but it would enforce BLM on discretionary uses moving forward. So that's really the key there. And that conservation, that mitigation can be for things that happen on private land, right? If you have ESA considerations or other things, you can use public lands to offset or mitigate. Again, will not impact valid existing rights. We're talking about discretionary uses only. And then the second way that BLM outlines a conservation lease or conservation easement is if a group comes in with funding, millions of dollars, to restore an area, do some sort of restoration or protect a key species. They want some sort of access to that area to do that restoration, some sort of guarantee that the BLM again won't allow discretionary uses that will impact the restoration they're trying to do, so they can get a conservation lease for a duration of 5 years to do that work. That lease can be renewed, but again, we're talking about just discretionary uses.
And just one last thing on the conservation leases. This was the first fact sheet that we asked the BLM to give us. So it's on its way, hopefully, and we'll be able to share that around with folks.
Great. And then actually, Michael, I think that's a really good point, and I want to bring up to you all, as we receive the BLM fact sheets, we will be passing them along to you all. So Broads and our conservation partners will be sharing those as we continue to get the information. This is not just the one and done. We're filling you all with this information today and not supporting you. This is the first step in Broads, and also, you know, our other conservation partners really, you know, working hand in hand with you all on our comments, getting your questions answered, because we still have questions. You know, we're still waiting to get some clarification on it, even though the clock is ticking for all of us with the deadline of June 20th. One question that we did have also with conservation leases regarding to grazing was conservation leases for grazing was tried in the BLM's 1995 grazing rule and was overturned through litigation. What is different with this rule to protect it from litigation?
So I think that might be, I don't know that specific litigation, but this must be different. Again, it won't impact valid existing rights, so it won't technically impact grazing. So it has to be different in how they would implement this.
And just, oh, sorry, Michael.
Oh, I was just going to add,
Good
I mean,
question.
Folks should be realistic here. We anticipate that the rule will be litigated at some point. So, you know, be prepared for this to be going through a litigation process as it moves forward. That people are going to challenge it as we move forward, for sure. All the more reason for people to put in substantive comments and really be, trying to do everything we can to win the day on the comment period.
And I just want to say, for the person who asked that question, I have your name written down, and we'll do a direct follow-up with you to see if we can get an answer down the line with that. Someone wanted to know is that, the BLM has a poor record of doing land health evaluations, especially for existing grazing allotments. Will this help them do it better everywhere? What will kind of happen with the health assessments?
Yeah, so the health assessments, look into the rule. I think there's some Easter eggs in there, and I think the agency is trying to better how they do health assessments. There's some definitions of what is undue degradation and how land health assessments are done and certain things. So will it be perfect off the bat? No, but they're trying to do a better job of having land health assessments be a consistent analysis that is used throughout the agency in a manner that is actually helpful. Is it perfect? No. I think just in general, this rule doesn't solve everything. It's really, really helpful. But yeah, as far as grazing, it'll be better. They're trying. Yeah.
Great. I'm going to hop over to some of the questions in the question and answer and not in the webinar chat. So one of the questions is Broad's national office doing substantive comments? Yes, we will be doing that. So we're going to be working with some of our partners on getting some of the feedback that they're working on. We're going to be talking to our different broadbands and leaders and such in doing so. So we will have more of a formal plan on that on Friday. We're actually talking about in our advocacy staff meeting tomorrow. So stay tuned on what that's exactly going to look like for engagement with our chapters. Another question is, what's the most impact? Many separate comments or great comments we all sign on to, as in 100 nonprofits sign on to comments.
Yes, and.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. Yes.
Yes, and I would say both, all of the above. And the one thing I'll also mention is we have a comment period that ends June 20th, but this is a year-long campaign until this rule comes out, and we need to continue the win in the court of public opinion, even though BLM's not technically taking our comments. So the things that you can do outside of comments, just LTEs and support and just broad showing your support in other ways, are going to be really important.
Yep.
Actually, Danielle, could you kind of talk about what happens after June 20th and then who makes the final decision on the rule?
It's a great question. So after June 20th, we in the conservation community have to continue to win, as I said, in the court of public opinion, and we need to continue to work with the administration to show them how important this rule is. We need to make sure that it maintains a top priority for the first term in the Biden administration. Those are key to getting this rule across the finish line. All of these comments go into the BLM black box. Again, I'm not being naive that comments are important, and so is the continued outreach. And then BLM is very clear that they want to see this rule released in 1 year from the date, or the final come out 1 year from the date that the draft was released. So we're looking at March 30th of 2024. That gets us way outside the Congressional Review Act, which I think they are really monitoring. It also helps give it a lot of space from the presidential election. And so those are two very important things, but we hope to see a final. A couple of things that might happen in the interim, but we don't have a guarantee. We might see some sort of guidance on implementation come out. Sometimes BLM does this with rulemaking just to kind of soften the world will end when the rulemaking comes out, is to kind of show how this could be implemented. So we might see some kind of interim documents come out, but to my understanding, we have a draft, we comment on the draft, and then we have a final.
Great, thank you. We've been talking a lot about grazing and the conservation leasing. What about OHV? We know that the off-road vehicle community is probably pushing back on this already, and the BLM has worked very closely with them in the past, and we hope they work closely with us too in the same way. But will these changes affect OHV's destructory, effects on habitats? What kind of effects will it have on OHV communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do want to say that the OHV community can be great allies. They were really supportive at Aviquame. They really wanted to see these backcountry roads protected as is and not kind of this sprawl network of kind of these cancerous routes. And so they were really supportive. And they were Bury Us a Snow Mountain. The Blue Ribbon Coalition was supportive. That has changed a little bit in the political. Blue Ribbon Coalition is now taking a pretty hard and fast stance on some of these things. So the OHV community is probably not going to be our friend in this. What I will say is it will impact OHV, especially in undesignated user created routes. This is going to impact intact landscapes and how BLM manages those and keeping account for those and degradation for those. So yes, OHV as a non-permitted or a kind of user created impact, it will very much so. And Michael, I don't know what you have to add for that.
No, you said it all. I mean, it will be game changing for that. So for sure.
Are there organizations already prepared to take on conservation easements or conservation leasing once this rule passes? Do we know that yet, or has there been rumblings?
That's a great question.
It is a good question. Yeah, really good question. Do you want to
go for it? Go for it.
Well, I'll kick us off here by just noting that there are plenty of organizations that do restoration and that do different sort of maintenance work that have been trying to make sure that they don't actually have the work that they do, the work that they fundraise around, and that they develop to mitigate, for development on a particular area by doing conservation on another area. Those organizations have been working for years without actually anything to, hang their hat on from the agency in terms of actual assurance and certainty around the work that they're doing. So those groups are going to continue to do those. The Southwest Conservation Corps right here in Durango, where I live, they've done this type of work for years and years. And there's those types of organizations, those conservation corps around the West that have done this for a long, long time. This will give them some certainty. So we anticipate that those groups will continue to be able to work on the landscape, and they'll be able to use the conservation leasing mechanism in this provision to be able to provide some certainty for the work that they're doing into the future.
Yeah, and I'll just add for the restoration part, completely agree. To add to that, the mitigation aspect, land trusts are already kind of set up for the conservation easement model, and that's exactly what this is. The other thing that is interesting is that tribes can hold conservation easements, which could be really cool, and that doesn't necessarily have to cost tangible dollars. That's just a holding of a right that BLM can't, impact or has to mitigate for certain things. And potentially, if they work out an assistance agreement, could come with funding to manage for that conservation easement. So, there's different tools and mechanisms around, leases or easements, however you want to call them.
Great. We have a great question. It's in the chat, and the question and answer is, do you have a sense of how the newly released mature and old growth inventory that applies both to BLM and Forest Service can be used to inform comments on the BLM rule? For an example, intact landscapes or new ACECs based on that. Can we help to find these?
Yes. So this is the type of thing that we said, this is how the rule could be improved. This is the exact thing. Chandra, please comment, because this is exactly what the rule should include is, hey, how about for old growth, which you didn't mention in the rule, once you inventory that, ACECs or intact landscapes, you must use these certain tools to then protect them or something along those lines. Yes, that's not in the rule though, but it should be.
And actually, that's kind of one thing I want to tag on to what Danielle is saying is we are thankful that this rule is coming out and that there's this opportunity. However, I will tell you right now, I want more. I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to speak for Danielle or Michael, but we have this opportunity to be bold, like lay out all of the stuff that should be in there that may not, or ask questions, because this is our opportunity to do it. And if we can be bold and really share what's important to us as broads in the conservation community that might not be included, we hopefully will be able to move that needle a little bit more and get them to come along, or at least listen to and see that these are important issues for us that are not going to be going away and that we want to see addressed in some way.
Yes. Can I just add to that very quickly? Just BLM has kind of said internally that this is the floor. This is not the ceiling. And, they welcome this. They welcome us pushing and saying we want more. And they want to be able to show the administration that the community wants more. And so the rule can be improved.
And Sarah, let me jump on the rah-rah train here a little bit with this. We've internally at TWS been telling people that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. The leadership at the BLM has never been better for us to actually see a rule implemented that would actually affect conservation this much. So be bold, be assertive, get your comments in, get your mother and your brother and everybody else to comment on this thing, because we need as many people chiming in on this and helping as possible and raising their voices on it for sure.
Thank you. Michael, I have another follow-up question that might be a little bit more state specific with BLM. Is there going to be an opportunity with our conservation partners, or where might we be able to provide our folks specific state info for like BLMs for their specific state acreage and such? So like for Arizona or Colorado or Wyoming, or like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the screen behind this Zoom screen on my computer is a list of fact sheets for each state in the West that this rule is going to impact. And we've been working on all of those. And we'll be sharing around links to all of those. So Sarah, I will make sure you have all of those fact sheets and then can circulate those to the broad group.
Great.
Yeah, and we'll also, that toolkit that Michael shared, we update that. So if we have new social or new toolkits, like you can kind of go back and see, and we'll definitely share them with you, but it's just another like that's a live document.
Yep. We have Colorado and New Mexico done. So Sarah, I'll get you those two pieces and the other ones are coming.
Great. Yeah, I just want to say, based on kind of what Danielle and Michael are sharing about, the fact sheets that are being developed by not only the agencies, but, our conservation groups who are working hand in hand in this, is that we need to be fluid as we are working on our comments. If you want to sign a letter now, please go ahead. But if you want to do something more specific, just be patient as this comes out. Keep the June 20th deadline in your mind. But know that we are all working as fast as we can to get you as much more information to really be impactful. Will Alaska be included?
It is.
It is included. And just, I don't know if any of you guys worked on the Bering Sea Plan, but during the Trump administration, they got rid of almost 1 million acres of ACECs without any sort of analysis. And the tribes there are really upset. But yes, this will include Alaska. Yes, yes.
I'm going to throw one more grazing question at you real quickly. Is grazing lease renewal discretionary?
Yes, and I mean, yeah, be like, deny based on like land health standards or that you're not meeting stuff, but like, do they?
Yeah.
Do they? They could also close lands for oil and gas leasing.
Right. There's a sacred cow joke to make right here, but I'm not gonna.
Yeah, I mean, all of these things. And again, this is where like there's a Venn diagram. Does it impact grazing directly? Not exactly. There's a grazing rule coming out, but if BLM has to consider intact landscapes and they have to consider other things, it's not just grazing, right? And it's not just, what they've done in the past.
Which is why you see a lot of the opposition that's come out so far basically giving away the game, right? Saying, oh, it's out of balance, but we like it that way, more or less, because they've had the run of the place. So.
Yeah, just someone who's worked on landscapes where, ACEC petitions for new designations for ACECs have been put in and ignored by the BLM 3 times in a 10-year period. I am looking forward to giving comments on ACECs, or, really talking about the habitat connectivity, making sure that we, connecting wilderness areas and wilderness study areas in these important lands. And even the tribal connection and being able to engage our tribal and indigenous partners with, co-management, co-stewardship. What does that look like with this new ruling?
You raise a really good point on the ACEC nomination that I just want to reiterate for folks too, because I know that the Broads have been like super champions of local ACECs for years, right? And been nominating places that have fallen on deaf ears by offices, frankly, to the shame of BLM for over and over again. This rule is the opportunity to now actually put those things back on the table and start anew. And say, hey, you have to consider these ACECs as you're doing planning. So we encourage folks to kind of once more into the breach, because we know that you've been nominating these places over and over and over again. But really to A, comment on the rule, and then B, be prepared to bring back those ACEC nominations that have gone unheard in the past so that we can actually get them implemented now.
Yeah, and even take advantage of the interim management.
Yes.
You don't have to wait till the rule is actually finalized. You can start helping the BLM socialize this now. Submit them tomorrow, resubmit them and say, there was guidance out on ACECs several months back that said you can manage these interim management. Let's start putting those back on the table now.
Yep.
Well, why don't we jump to water real quickly, if you have a moment for that? How does ecological water count towards their intact landscapes?
Intact landscapes, not so much. For ecosystem resilience, watersheds are like a crucial component. And there's a look at the rule. I can't think of it on the top of my head, but there's so much in there that is about watershed health, and there are different standards now being applied to water and watersheds in this rule. So very significant, and I can pull those specific parts out and send that. I don't know who, maybe flag that and we can follow, but it is a significant part of ecosystem resilience and land health. Significant.
Okay. We may have talked about this one a little bit earlier. I'm just going to kind of bring it up because it's another one that popped up, is who gets to define what intact means in the context of the rule? Is BLM scientists or its administrators, or how is that definition of intact going to roll out?
Good question. Well, there's a very specific definition in the rule. It reads a lot like your lands with wilderness characteristics. It's very similar to something along those lines. And who is going to determine how it is implemented, or how that is determined, is probably the first couple of years of implementing this rule and the battle that's in front of us Broads, us conservation community, and kind of making trying to have BLM interpret to a really high standard. And those things I think are going to be figured out in the implementation process, but look at the definition.
And I'll just flag in the toolkit that we sent around to you all, there's a link that breaks down a lot of what's in the rule, and there's direct links in that document that take you to the section that Danielle's talking about in the rule, where you can just read it yourself. There's also recommendations on that document as well.
It's 6 o'clock.
Oh, there goes my 6 o'clock announcement. I've got to figure out how to turn that off.
Oh, funny.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And the 6 o'clock reminder. We are scheduled, just so you know, to take questions till 6:30. I don't know how long people want to go for, but if they keep on coming, if Danielle and Michael are okay for hanging on a little bit more, okay, awesome. Great. So let's see. We were in court today to reinstate the 21-inch rule for Eastern Oregon. How will these rules fit together? 21-inch rule is Forest Service, but it also has, so nothing really with this, or we can do a follow-up.
Yeah, this is probably a follow-up. I mean, just think about it. These are not even two different agencies. These are whole two different departments. We're talking about like the Department of Ag and the Department of Interior. And so while we think Forest Service and BLM should have overlap in policies. They really just don't. If they could talk to each other, that'd be nice. But like, yeah, this is really just BLM. Again, it does relate to forest because BLM does manage forests, but when it comes to Forest Service rules, legal policy.
So as broadband members, or if we have broadband leaders or broadbands, how many letters do you recommend us signing on to? You know, are we gonna dull the voice if, you know, broads or our broad chapters sign on to, you know, 6 different letters and things along those lines? What's okay?
I mean, I don't think you get, but if they're different letters, right? But
Yeah.
if like you have a letter that's focused on ecosystem resilience and you sign on that letter, great. If you have one that's focused on like, you know, old growth and how it should impact that, and you sign it, great. Like just show your support. I don't, yeah.
Danielle, let me chime in and just make one statement about the
Yep.
sort of letters and comments on this too. Make them the bands, right? Like, so to the extent that you guys can bring out like local examples, how and things you'd like to see on the landscapes in your backyard for each of those kind of different categories and different areas where you're addressing specific things in the rule, all the better, right? The more detail we can have in these, the better off we're going to be down the road. So make them as, you know, substantive as you can, but use a lot of local examples, what you all would like to see on the ground.
Thank you so much for that. I agree. Local examples are the best. It really just shows the impact that this can make the difference and what's going on that, you know, they may not know about in Washington, D.C. And we need to flag and say, hey, this is important in these 12 places. Listen to us also.
Well, and Sarah, one thing to chime in on that is folks need to remember that, you know, the rule itself is not the finish line. The rule is the start line of all of this. What we're hoping to do is to get everybody to comment on the rule, cement a really solid rule so that we can use it through the planning process. So the more local examples you have in the letters that you're submitting now and in the comments that you're submitting now, the better off we're going to be when we shift to updating those local management plans so that you can actually call those specifics out as part of those local management plans.
Yeah, and that's why broads is so important in this effort, because it's the top down and the bottom up. And like you guys work on ACECs and you work on national policy. And a lot of groups don't play in those spaces. They don't do both, right? So.
And for those of you who are on the call and may not know, Great Old Broads for Wilderness now has 43 broadbands or chapters in 18 different states. So we have a great presence going on. It's just not in the West. I want to recognize that we have a chapter in the Northeast. We have our Nor'easters. We have a chapter that's getting started in Georgia. We are in the Midwest now in Nebraska and Iowa and Minnesota and Wisconsin. And I am proud to say we have a mobile broadband that's going on right now also for folks who are part of the long distance hiking community and want to get involved with their land. So it's exciting to see all the different landscapes that we are working on that we can talk about in this important ruling right now. So it seems like, oh, no, I was wrong. I see a couple more questions popping up real quick. Let's see, Michael, the state fact sheet for Oregon. Can you include the Western Oregon MOG forests on BLM land? I've heard we have the most BLM old forests, but I don't have details of where or how much.
Interesting. I'll definitely, we'll make note of your comment and I'll follow up with you because definitely that level of detail we'd love to pull into the fact sheet. So absolutely.
Great. And then Michael, I can connect you with her afterwards. I have the contact for that.
Perfect.
And then do you recommend focusing on the current WSAs regarding where intact landscapes are and how those protections should be continued?
So that is a good question. And I'm happy that that came up, is because people keep asking how there's a separate kind of effort going on to get the BLM to start to implement new wilderness study areas, which they have the authority to do. They just haven't done in 20 years because of an out of court settlement by a horrible Secretary of Interior Norton. That being said, BLM has the authority And wilderness study areas have very strong protections, and BLM knows how to manage that, and it's in the Wilderness Act. And so there doesn't need to be a rule or any guidance on them. I would say that this rule helps elevate the importance of tools like wilderness areas, but for certain reasons, they're just not going to be highlighted here as not to kind of shine a spotlight or a target on that. But BLM hopefully will start to actually implement and start designating new wilderness study areas in this administration. And I encourage folks, though, to put in your comments that you want to make sure that intact landscapes or already designated or inventoried lands with wilderness characteristics are considered for wilderness study area designations or manages intact wilderness, or those type of comments that really highlight the need to protect those intact ecosystems, because that's what 30 by 30 is based on.
Yep. The only thing I'll add to that is we anticipate that we're going to see, hopefully, some of these new WSA designations through existing plans that are being considered by the BLM right now. So all the more reason to get involved in those local planning processes if they're underway in your backyards, and be advocating for those lands with wilderness characteristics that the BLM's already inventoried, which most of the plans have tons of those in them in terms of acreage, to be advocating for those to be WSAs and get them into those final plans once they actually get enacted.
So if a BLM office just finished an RMP, and for those of you, that's a resource management plan, do we have to wait years for the rule to apply to these offices and areas, or what's the best way to kind of move forward now with that?
You just finished one, that's a little tough. There are things in here, though, that still apply. There's a lot of interim management decisions, conservation easements. There's inventories that have to happen every 5 years. So you could use the science or the inventory that just happened to help your state office see what's in that planning area. Some people have asked you, does it apply to plans that are happening right now or will be finished after the rulemaking? And the answer is kind of like yes and no. No, technically, legally, it doesn't have to apply, but this administration wants this rule and they want to implement this rule, and they want the BLM in the field office to start understanding what this rule will do. So I would say if you're working on planning now, or if a plan's going to start in your region in the next year or so, let's think about together how we start infusing these concepts into that planning process, right? Let's make sure ACECs are nominated as part of that process. Let's look at that area and look at what lands with wilderness characteristics are in those. Those are surely intact landscapes, right? Let's start thinking about the concepts that are in the rule and how we start applying them through planning, because that's what the agency leadership wants to see.
And some of the components of the actual rule can be implemented outside of the planning process. So as Danielle was, noting, ACECs in particular are called out. They actually had an instruction memorandum that went out last fall that basically said that the offices have to consider those areas, whether it's in planning or outside of planning. So, stay with it. If you didn't get everything you wanted out of the final decision on a rule, or on your planning process, stick with it, and let's, figure that out together of how to renominate some of those places if they weren't. So, yeah.
So it's really great that we have so many folks in the conservation community working on this. Is there a way to find out what other groups in different states might have comment letters going on, or ways to get involved not only with Broads, but with also other conservation groups in different states?
Ooh, that's a good one, because there are a lot of groups working on this. I think the best way might be to just work with Sarah, get you first, like just the overviews, and then we are going to, in the future, have state specific like action alerts, day of action. We are working on getting like state local elected sign-ons, and then Broads could be really great at reaching out to their local elected leaders. So those are ongoing and happening. And I think it's just making sure we connect closely with Sarah and her team so she can kind of reach out. But I don't know, Michael, if you have other thoughts on that.
No, I think that's right. We're tracking a number of like everybody from national groups to big regional groups to working with Sarah to try and keep track of everything that's going on. But there are groups across the West that we can't, that aren't on our list. So I think as this is where I'll put the your question back on you actually for a response. Reach out to those groups. If they're groups that you've known and you've worked with in the past and have been good partners for you locally, reach out to them and find out what they're doing on the rule, because odds are they are working on letters or they're working with, you know, other organizations. So reach out to them and find out what they're doing and then get engaged.
Okay. So not to be a Sarah Sourpuss, what happens if the rule comment period drags out so that industry has more time to oppose it and provide misleading messages to the public? What are the consequences of a delay?
Yeah. So I will say, again, this goes back to leadership and BLM. We have some really smart and strategic folks in there that want this to happen. So I think the comment period will not be delayed. I've heard kind of clearly that they don't want that to happen. And June 20th is a pretty hard and fast deadline. And then they also are very aware of the election, the administration getting cold feet from higher up. And the Congressional Review Act, which allows Congress to go back and override a rule within a certain time period, and they want to stay way outside of that. So they are really aware of deadlines and kind of moving this forward. I will say that industry might come out and oppose it within those timeframes. And so far, you know, because this really is about balance and implementing the intent of FLTMA, factually, we're going to win. From a public narrative standpoint, we need more folks like you guys to outweigh them, out-organize the opposition. And that's just, we just need to do that from the conservation community perspective.
That was my point. And I'll put a maybe a starker point on it. You know,
okay,
industry's coming, right?
Yeah.
Opposition is coming. And whether it's within the comment period up to June 20th, or frankly, in the time after that, when we're trying to get the rule finalized after the comment period, they're going to do everything they can to make sure that they keep their thumb on the scale of balance within the agency so that they can run the table. So we just need to Danielle's point, out organize them, make sure we're getting all of our letters and comments, getting our sisters and our mothers and our brothers and everybody else to chime in on this rule so that we're just out, you know, basically shouting them in the course of all of this.
Well, thank you. We have answered all of the questions you all have sent us in the questions and answers and in the chat. I have a list of folks who I will be doing direct follow-up. I have just put in the chat for you all my direct email. If you have more questions for Danielle or Michael, I can work on getting those answered for you. I will be making connections where need be. I received a question in the chat about, well, what if we know of some of those other local groups working on this and want to be a part of the bigger group? Yes. Email me, please, and we can make those connections with our partners and find a way to get them engaged and, you know, working on things on a specific state level. I appreciate those of you who have reached out in the chat who want to work on this a little bit more in depth or who has more knowledge on their state. We will be reaching out to you for that, for our fact sheets. Thank you for making that offer. Thank you for being here tonight. First of all, I want to thank Danielle and I want to thank Michael for coming and really knowing this and diving in, and for all of the work you've done on this over the last couple of years and what's going to be coming even longer, and for your commitments to our public lands and our BLM public lands. So thank you. I also want to thank my staff who are on the call doing the behind the scenes and listening, and thank all of you. Thank you for coming on a Monday night. We had a great turnout. As I mentioned, we will be sending out the additional information. And yes, we will be sending out all of the links that were here in the chat to you all. So we'll be working the next couple of days to putting together a really in-depth email to you. So have a wonderful evening. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for being a part of Great Old Broads for Wilderness. Thank you for caring about our wild places. And let's just do what we need to do to keep these places special and protected.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Have a good night.
Bye.